In the 1980s, in a barn in rural northwestern Pennsylvania, someone found a manuscript. It was old, it was handwritten, and it was incomplete. The first 101 pages were missing. Torn out, gone. That manuscript was the original text of Dracula, the most famous horror novel ever written. And those missing pages? They contained something that Bram Stoker's own publisher refused to print. Something so disturbing, so close to the truth, that the editor returned the manuscript with a single word: no. You see, Bram Stoker never intended Dracula to be a novel. He intended it to be a warning, a true account of a very real evil. His publisher forced him to fictionalize it, to cut those first 101 pages, to change names, to blur the line between what happened and what was invented, because London was still reeling from the Whitechapel murders, and no one could stomach another monster. But Stoker was clever. He hid the truth in plain sight. He scattered breadcrumbs across different editions, in different countries, in different languages. And tonight, on Impossible Atlas, we are going to follow those breadcrumbs. We are going to reconstruct the real story behind Dracula, the story of a sickly Irish boy, a tyrannical actor, a crumbling abbey on a cliff, and a 15th century warlord whose name meant son of the dragon. This is the story Bram Stoker tried to tell the world. The story the world was not ready to hear. Abraham Stoker was born on November 8, 1845, in Clontarf, a coastal suburb of Dublin, Ireland. And for the first 7 years of his life, he could not stand. He could not walk. He could not leave his bed. No doctor could diagnose what was wrong with him. His mother, Charlotte, a woman who had survived the Great Famine and witnessed cholera epidemics that killed thousands, would sit beside his bed and tell him stories. Not fairy tales, not bedtime stories. She told him about the cholera, about how the sick were sometimes buried alive, about how coffins were fitted with bells so that the prematurely interred could signal for help, about how entire villages were sealed off and left to die. These were the bedtime stories of Bram Stoker. Death that was not quite death. Bodies that moved when they should have been still. The terror of being trapped between the living and the dead. If you have ever wondered where Dracula came from, where that specific visceral horror of the undead was born, it was born in a child's bedroom in Dublin, in the voice of a mother who had seen too much. And then, miraculously, Stoker recovered. Not just recovered, he thrived. At Trinity College, Dublin, he became an athlete, a champion walker, and the president of the Philosophical Society. He became a civil servant, a theater critic, and a man of considerable intellect. But none of that mattered the night he walked into a theater and saw Henry Irving perform. Henry Irving was the most famous actor in the English-speaking world. He was magnetic. He was terrifying. He could hold an audience of 2,000 people in absolute silence with nothing more than a whisper. And when Stoker saw him perform, something inside the young Irishman broke. He didn't just admire Irving. He was consumed by him. After one particular performance, Stoker went backstage and wept. Irving, amused and perhaps flattered, offered him a job. Stoker accepted. He would spend the next 27 years as Irving's personal manager, his secretary, his servant, his shadow. Irving was brilliant. Irving was also a monster. He was vain, manipulative, and emotionally cruel. He treated Stoker not as a colleague, but as a possession. He demanded absolute loyalty and gave nothing in return. Stoker managed every aspect of Irving's life. his finances, his correspondence, his travel, his meals, while Irving took all the credit and offered none of the recognition. For 27 years, Stoker served a man who drained him of his time, his energy, his ambition, and his identity. Does that dynamic sound familiar? A powerful, aristocratic figure who feeds on the life force of those around him? A man who commands absolute devotion and discards his servants when they are no longer useful? Scholars have debated for over a century whether Count Dracula was based on Vlad the Impaler. But the answer may be simpler and far more personal. Count Dracula was Henry Irving, and Bram Stoker knew it. In the summer of 1890, Bram Stoker arrived in Whitby. He was 45 years old. He had been working on a story for years, a vampire story, inspired by his mother's tales, by Irish folklore, by the legends of the Darach Dhu, the blood-drinking spirits of Celtic mythology. He had notes. He had characters. He had a villain named Count Wampir, but he did not yet have a name. He did not yet have a place. He did not yet have the final piece. At the Whitby subscription library, Stoker requested a rare book, The Accounts of Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. This was not a book on the public shelves. You had to know it existed. You had to ask for it by name. And Stoker knew, because his friend, Arminius Vambry, a Hungarian professor and adventurer, had told him about it 4 months earlier at a dinner in London. Stoker opened the book to a specific section. He found a passage about a Wallachian prince, and in his journal he wrote a single word, Dracula. Beneath it, he added a note. Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. He crossed out Count Wampir and wrote Count Dracula. And in that moment, the most iconic villain in literary history was born. But Whitby gave Stoker more than a name. It gave him a story. A few years before his visit, a Russian schooner called the Dmitri had run aground in Whitby harbor during a violent storm. The ship had originated in Varna, a port on the Black Sea. Its cargo was mysterious, crates filled with earth. When rescue workers boarded the vessel, most of the crew were dead or dying. And as they searched the hull, a large black dog was seen leaping from the ship and running up the 199 steps from the beach into the graveyard of St. Mary's Church. In the novel, the ship is called the Demeter. The cargo is coffins filled with Transylvanian earth. The dog is Dracula himself, shape-shifted into animal form. But the bones of the story, the ghost ship, the dead crew, the beast escaping into the graveyard, were real. Stoker found them in the logbooks of the Royal Coast Guard at Whitby Harbor. And then there was the Abbey itself. Whitby Abbey, perched on the cliff above the harbor, had been a ruin since the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. Its Gothic arches, its empty windows, its skeletal silhouette against the sky. It was the perfect image of ancient, crumbling power. Stoker stood in the graveyard below and looked up at it, and he saw Castle Dracula, not in Transylvania, in Yorkshire. He took everything Whitby gave him, the name, the ship, the dog, the abbey, the graveyard, the 199 steps, and he wove them into the fabric of his novel. Chapters 6 through 8 of Dracula are set almost entirely in Whitby, and they are among the most atmospheric passages in English literature. When Dracula was finally published on May 26, 1897, it was unlike anything the Victorian reading public had encountered. It was not written as a traditional narrative. It was assembled from fragments, journal entries, letters, telegrams, newspaper clippings, even a ship's log. There is no single narrator. There is no omniscient voice. Instead, the reader must piece together the truth from multiple, often contradictory, accounts. It is, in a sense, the first found-footage horror story, written a century before the Blair Witch Project. But the genius of Dracula is not its structure. It is what the structure conceals. On the surface, it is a story about a vampire who travels from Transylvania to England to feed on innocent women. But beneath that surface, it is a story about everything that terrified Victorian England. Immigration. Dracula is a foreigner, an Eastern European aristocrat who arrives in England with crates of foreign soil, who buys property, who moves silently among the population, who corrupts English women. In 1897, England was experiencing a wave of immigration from Eastern Europe, and the anxieties about the foreign other were intense. Dracula is the immigrant as monster, ancient, unknowable, and hungry. Disease. Dracula's bite is an infection. It spreads through blood. It transforms the victim into something inhuman. In the 1890s, the germ theory of disease was still relatively new, and the public was terrified of contagion, of cholera, of tuberculosis, of syphilis. Dracula is disease personified, invisible, unstoppable, and transmitted through the most intimate of contacts. Sexuality. This is perhaps the most subversive layer. Dracula does not simply kill his victims, he seduces them. He enters their bedrooms at night. He penetrates their skin. He exchanges bodily fluids. And his victims, Lucy Westenra, Mina Harker, do not simply die. They are transformed. They become sexually aggressive, predatory, dangerous. In a society that demanded female purity and submission, Dracula's greatest crime was not murder. It was liberation and technology. The heroes of Dracula do not defeat the vampire with crosses and garlic alone. They use typewriters, phonographs, telegrams, and blood transfusions. They are modern people fighting an ancient evil with modern tools. Stoker was fascinated by technology. He was one of the first people in England to own a typewriter, and he understood that the battle between Dracula and his hunters was really the battle between the old world and the new. This is why Dracula endures. It is not just a horror story. It is a mirror. Every generation sees its own fears reflected in the Count's pale face. In the 1890s, it was immigration and disease. In the 1930s, it was fascism. In the 1960s, it was sexual revolution. In the 2020s, it is pandemic and isolation. Dracula is immortal not because he is a vampire, but because he is a metaphor. And then there is the castle itself. Stoker never visited Transylvania. He never set foot in Romania. He built Castle Dracula entirely from library books, maps, and his own imagination. And yet the castle he described, perched on a precipice, surrounded by wolves, its rooms filled with dust and ancient furniture and no mirrors, is one of the most vivid locations in all of literature. It is a place of absolute isolation, a prison disguised as a palace. Jonathan Harker arrives as a guest and realizes, slowly, horribly, that he is a prisoner. The doors are locked. The windows open onto a sheer drop. The Count can climb the walls like a lizard. There is no escape. This is Stoker's genius as a world builder. He understood that the most terrifying place in the world is not a dungeon or a graveyard. It is a beautiful room with no exit. Castle Dracula is hospitality weaponized. It is the smile of a predator. And every detail, the empty mirrors, the wolves at the door, the Count's shadow that moves independently of his body, serves a single purpose: to make you feel trapped. Stoker also understood something that most horror writers forget. The monster is most frightening when he is polite. Dracula does not attack Harker when he arrives. He welcomes him. He serves him dinner. He asks about English real estate law. He is courteous, educated, and charming. And it is precisely this courtesy that makes the horror so effective. Because the reader, like Harker, knows something is wrong, but cannot point to a single moment of overt threat. The danger is in the atmosphere, in the silence between words, in the meal that the host never eats. Bram Stoker died on April 20th, 1912, 6 days after the Titanic sank. He was 64 years old, impoverished, and largely forgotten. Dracula had received mixed reviews. It sold modestly. Stoker never saw a penny from adaptations. He died believing his life's work had been a failure. He could not have been more wrong. In 1922, a German filmmaker named F.W. Murnau made an unauthorized adaptation called Nosferatu. He changed the names. Dracula became Count Orlok. Transylvania became Wisborg. But the story was unmistakable. Stoker's widow, Florence, sued. She won. A court ordered every copy of the film destroyed. But some copies survived. They always survive. And Nosferatu became one of the most influential horror films ever made, a masterpiece born from piracy. In 1931, Universal Studios released Dracula starring Bela Lugosi, a Hungarian actor who barely spoke English. Lugosi's performance defined the character for the next century. The cape, the accent, the slow, deliberate movements. The famous line, "I am Dracula." Everything you picture when you hear the word vampire comes from Lugosi's performance. He was so identified with the role that when he died in 1956, he was buried in his Dracula cape at his own request. In 1958, Christopher Lee brought Dracula back for Hammer Film Productions, and he brought something Lugosi never had: physicality. Lee's Dracula was tall, powerful, and terrifying. He moved like a predator. He was not seductive. He was violent. Lee played the role in 10 films over 15 years, and he hated every single one of them. He begged the studio to let him stop. They refused. The films were too profitable. Lee, like Stoker before him, had become a prisoner of the Count. Since 1922, Dracula has appeared in over 1,000 films. He is the most portrayed literary character in cinema history after Sherlock Holmes. He has been played by everyone from Lugosi to Lee to Gary Oldman to Claes Bang. He has been reimagined as a romantic hero, a tragic anti-hero, a political allegory, a comedy, and a children's cartoon. He has generated billions of dollars in revenue. He has inspired an entire genre of fiction, an entire subculture of fandom, and an entire tourism industry in Romania. And Bram Stoker never saw any of it. He died 6 years before Nosferatu. He died believing he had failed. Today, Romania's tourism industry is built on Dracula. Bran Castle, which has only a tenuous connection to Vlad the Impaler and no connection whatsoever to Stoker's novel, receives over 500,000 visitors a year. They come because of a book written by an Irishman who never visited Romania, based on a character who was named after a footnote in a library book in Yorkshire. The entire Dracula tourism industry is built on a magnificent chain of misunderstandings, and it generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually. In Whitby, the story is different but equally powerful. Every year, Thousands of Gothic subculture enthusiasts descend on the town for the Whitby Goth Weekend, a festival that exists entirely because Bram Stoker spent a summer there in 1890. They climb the 199 steps. They visit the Abbey. They stand in the graveyard where Stoker stood and look out at the same sea. The town that gave Stoker his story has been transformed by it, permanently, irrevocably, and profitably. We began this episode with a mystery. What was on the first 101 pages of Dracula? The pages that Bram Stoker's editor refused to publish. The pages that were cut, lost, and never recovered. We may never know, but we know what Stoker intended. He intended Dracula to be true. He intended it as a warning, not of vampires, but of the things vampires represent. The powerful feeding on the powerless, the ancient consuming the modern, the foreign corrupting the familiar, the dead refusing to stay dead. Bram Stoker was an Irish outsider in Victorian England. He spent 27 years serving a man who treated him like a servant. He poured his fears, his frustrations, his childhood nightmares, and his adult anxieties into a single novel. And then the world took that novel and made it into something he never imagined, a myth, a cultural touchstone, an immortal story. The 101 missing pages are gone, but Stoker's breadcrumbs remain, scattered across editions, translations, and footnotes around the world. He could not tell his story whole, so he broke it into pieces and hid them where they would never die. Much like his famous vampire, the truth only sleeps. It waits. Next week on Impossible Atlas, we leave the Gothic castles of Transylvania for a laboratory in Geneva. A story about a teenage girl, a summer storm, and the most terrifying question in science. What happens when you bring the dead back to life? Episode 7, Frankenstein. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.